The sun hung low over the Red Rock Mountains, casting long shadows across the parched grasslands of western Colorado. Dust swirled through the streets of Copper Creek, a mining town that had seen better days before the silver veins ran thin. The year was 1882, and lawway in these parts was as scarce as rain in July. Sarah Mae Thompson stood at the window of the ramshackle wooden house that had been her home for 3 years. Her husband's brothers had just left, their boots heavy on the porch, their words heavier still in the air. "You best start earning your keep, woman," Jake had said, the eldest of the Thompson brothers. "Tom's been dead 2 weeks now, and we ain't running no charity house." She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching them disappear into McGraw's saloon. 23 years old, widowed, and now at the mercy of men who saw her as nothing more than a burden to be turned profitable. Tom had died in a cave-in at the Blessed Virgin Mine, along with 6 other men. The compensation from the mining company had been swallowed up by his brothers faster than whiskey on a Saturday night. The town had turned its back on her since Tom's death. Whispers followed her to the general store, to the well, even to church on the rare Sundays she still attended. "Bad luck follows that one," they said. "First her parents with the fever, now Tom. Best keep your distance." Sarah Mae's fingers traced the worn wood of the window frame. The house was falling apart, roof leaked when it rained, walls had gaps that let in the winter wind, and the floorboards groaned with every step. But it was the only shelter she had, and even that came with a price she was beginning to understand. That first night, Frank Thompson, the middle brother, had made it clear. He'd stumbled in drunk, reeking of cheap whiskey and tobacco. "You're gonna help us make back what we spent burying Tom," he'd slurred. Plenty of lonely miners willing to pay for a woman's company. She'd tried to run then. But where would she go? No family, no money, no friends in a town that believed she carried death in her wake. The Thompson brothers made sure everyone knew she was their responsibility now, their property by some twisted interpretation of family obligation. The yellow lamplight from McGraw's saloon cast sickly shadows on the dirt street. She could hear the coarse laughter of men, the clinking of glasses, the scraping of chairs. Soon they would come for her. They always did when the night grew dark and the liquor flowed freely. Her hands trembled as she lit the oil lamp in what used to be her bedroom. The sheets were clean, she made sure of that, clinging to some shred of dignity in the face of humiliation. The first time they'd brought a man to her door, she'd fought. Jake had backhanded her so hard she tasted blood for days. "You'll learn," he'd said, "one way or another." The men who came were mostly miners, their faces darkened by coal dust and hard living. Some were rough, some surprisingly gentle, but all looked at her with the same expression, a mixture of lust and pity that made her stomach turn. They paid the Thompson brothers, never her. She was merchandise, nothing more. Sarah Mae heard boots on the porch and steeled herself. This was her life now, measured in nights of shame and days of isolation. The women in town crossed the street when they saw her coming, clutching their shawls tight and whispering behind gloved hands. The minister had told her she was no longer welcome in his congregation. "For the sake of the decent families," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. A knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. She knew better than to keep them waiting. As she moved to answer, she caught a reflection in the cracked mirror by the door. Green eyes that had once sparkled with joy were now dull, ringed with shadows. Her auburn hair, Tom's pride, hung limp and lifeless. She barely recognized the ghost staring back at her. "Sarah Mae!" Jake's voice boomed through the door. "Got company for you, girl. Make him feel welcome now." She opened the door to find Jake with a grizzled miner she'd seen before, Samuel Hutchins from the Silver Dollar Claim. He avoided her eyes as Jake collected his payment, counting the coins with thick fingers. 2 hours, Jake said to Hutchins. "Not a minute more." Then to Sarah Mae. "And you, no troubles. You hear?" As Jake's footsteps faded, Sarah Mae led Hutchins inside. He mumbled something about being sorry for her loss, but she barely heard him. She'd learned to retreat deep within herself during these encounters, to a place where Tom still lived and held her safe. Later, as Hutchins left and the night grew colder, Sarah May sat by the dying fire. Sometimes she thought about the rope in the barn, about the blessed silence it would bring. But something held her back. Not hope exactly, but a stubborn refusal to let the Thompson brothers win completely. She didn't know that on this very night, a lone cowboy had ridden into Copper Creek, dust-covered and weary from the cattle trails. She didn't know he'd taken a room above the general store, or that he'd watched from his window as she'd been led like livestock from her home. She didn't know that Clayton Wade, a man who'd seen enough cruelty in his 35 years to last 2 lifetimes, had clenched his fists so tight his knuckles went white. All Sarah May knew was that tomorrow would bring more of the same. More shame, more whispers, more nights when she prayed for Tom to come back and save her from this hell. In the distance, coyotes howled at the moon, their cries echoing off the canyon walls like the lamentations of lost souls. She pulled her shawl tighter and prepared for bed, unaware that the winds of change had begun to blow through Copper Creek, carried on the spurs of a cowboy who'd seen too much to turn away from injustice one more time. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Each night brought new faces to Sarah May's door, though some became shamefully familiar. The Thompson brothers had established a routine as predictable as it was cruel. Jake would collect payment at McGraw's saloon. Frank would escort the men to her house, and Hank, the youngest, would stand guard outside, making sure she didn't try to run. One particularly cold November evening, the wind howled through the gaps in the walls as Sarah May was led to the back room of McGraw's establishment. This was worse than the house visits. Here, she felt like cattle at auction, displayed for whoever had coin to spend. The yellow lamplight made shadows dance on the smoke-stained walls, while men played cards and drank, occasionally glancing her way with calculating eyes. "Fresh widow, boys," Jake announced with a merchant's smile. "Treat her gentle-like, and she'll show you a good time." Sarah May kept her eyes fixed on a water stain on the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood. Anything to avoid seeing the faces around her. She'd learned that invisibility was her only armor in these moments. Some part of her soul had learned to drift away, to float above her body like smoke from the oil lamps. Margaret Wilkins, the banker's wife, happened to pass by the saloon's window that night with her sister. Both women stopped, peered inside, then hurried away with scandalized gasps. By morning, the entire town would know that the Thompson widow had fallen to the lowest depths. The whispers would grow louder, the turned backs more deliberate. That Sarah May Thompson, she heard Mrs. Pemberton say at the well the next day, parading herself like well, I won't say the word, and her poor husband not even cold in his grave. Sarah May said nothing, drawing her water in silence. What could she say? That she was forced? That the Thompson brothers gave her no choice? The town had made up its mind about her. She was no longer Tom Thompson's grieving widow. She was something else entirely, something that decent folk didn't acknowledge in daylight. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Copper Creek in deceptive purity. Sarah May's thin shawl offered little protection against the bitter wind as Frank dragged her through the streets one evening. Her shoes, worn through at the soles, let in the slush and cold. But physical discomfort had become so constant that she barely noticed anymore. That night, a new face appeared at McGraw's, a railroad surveyor named Edmund Cray, his pockets heavy with company money. He was rougher than most, his hands cruel, his words crueler. When he finally left, Sarah May curled into herself on the bed, a broken bird with clipped wings. A purple bruise bloomed on her cheek where Cray had struck her for crying. "You mark her face again, you pay double," Jake told Cray later. "Damaged goods don't sell well." The words echoed in Sarah May's mind. Damaged goods. Is that all she was now? She thought of Tom, of how gently he'd courted her, bringing wildflowers and pretty stones from the mine. He'd promised her a good life, children, a home filled with laughter. Now those dreams were as dead as he was. Winter deepened, and with it, Sarah May's despair. The townsfolk had grown used to seeing her shepherded through the streets at night. Some men averted their eyes in shame, perhaps remembering their own wives or daughters. But most simply saw her as part of Copper Creek's seedier landscape, as unremarkable as the drunks who slept in alleys or the card sharks who preyed on naive miners. One brutal evening in December, the temperature dropped so low that ice formed inside the windows. Sarah May had been brought to a grain storage shed behind the saloon. The back room was full with a poker tournament. The shed smelled of moldy hay and mouse droppings. A miner named Willis Granger waited there, already drunk, his breath visible in the frigid air, as she endured another night of degradation. Sarah May's mind wandered to the well at the edge of town. It was deep, they said, deep enough that you'd be dead before you hit bottom. The thought had begun to comfort her in strange ways. A door she could walk through when the burden became too heavy to bear. But she held on, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was spite, a refusal to give the Thompson brothers the satisfaction of breaking her completely. Or perhaps it was something else, some flicker of faith that this couldn't be how her story ended. Neither she nor the Thompson brothers noticed the lone cowboy who'd taken to frequenting McGraw's saloon. Clayton Wade sat in the corner, nursing a single whiskey for hours, his gray eyes taking in everything while seeming to look at nothing. He'd watched Jake collect his blood money, watched Frank lead Sarah May like a lamb to slaughter, watched the town turn its collective back on a woman who needed help. One night, Clayton followed at a distance as Sarah May was taken back to her house. He saw her stumble in the snow, saw Frank yank her roughly to her feet, saw the defeat in her shoulders. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in his years wandering the frontier, but something about this, the systematic destruction of a woman's spirit, set his blood boiling. Back in his room above the general store, Clayton Wade stood at the window, looking out at the Thompson house. A lamp burned in an upstairs window, and he could see shadows moving behind the thin curtains. His hand rested on his Colt .45, the weight familiar and comforting. Not yet, he muttered to himself. But soon. Sarah May, unaware of her silent guardian, lay in her cold bed counting the days since Tom's death. 47 days of hell with no end in sight. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Copper Creek's sins in temporary white. But snow melts, she thought. Snow always melts, and the ugliness beneath always shows through. She closed her eyes and tried to remember Tom's face, but found it fading like everything good in her life. All that remained was the present. The knock on the door, the exchange of coins, the weight of strangers, and the terrible silence of a town that had decided she wasn't worth saving. Clayton Wade had been watching for 2 weeks now, learning the patterns, understanding the depths of the Thompson brothers' cruelty. He was a man who'd learned patience on the cattle trails, where a wrong move could spook 1,000 head of longhorns. His weathered face, marked by sun and wind, rarely showed emotion, but those who knew him understood that still waters ran deep. He'd come to Copper Creek looking for work, maybe a place to winter after a long drive up from Texas. Instead, he'd found something that wouldn't let him sleep. Injustice so blatant it mocked everything he'd been taught about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His mother, God rest her soul, would have boxed his ears for even thinking of walking away. Clayton stood at the bar in McGraw's, his dust-covered coat still carrying the smell of the open range. He wore his gun low on his hip, the holster worn smooth from years of use. Men gave him space instinctively, recognizing the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced down trouble and lived to tell about it. "You been nursing that whiskey for an hour, cowboy," McGraw said, wiping down the bar. "Bad for business." Clayton dropped another coin on the scarred wood. "Pour me another, then, and keep your opinions to yourself." He'd learned plenty in his quiet observations. The Thompson brothers were bullies, but cowards at heart. Jake carried a hideout gun in his boot. Frank favored his left hand in a fight, and Hank was all bluster with no real sand. They ruled through fear and the town's indifference, but they'd never faced someone who pushed back hard. 3 nights after the snowstorm, Clayton witnessed something that finally pushed him past watching. He was heading back from checking on his horse when he saw Sarah May by the old well at the town's edge. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light. She stood at the edge, a rope in her hands, her face turned up to the stars. Clayton moved quietly, a skill learned from years of night watches on the trail. He could see her lips moving, a prayer, maybe, or a goodbye. The rope was already tied into a noose, her fingers testing the knot with terrible familiarity. "That's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, ma'am." Sarah May spun around, the rope falling from nerveless fingers. Clayton stood 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty, his voice gentle as if talking to a spooked mare. "You don't know anything about it?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Know enough," Clayton said, moving closer but keeping his movements slow. "Know the Thompson boys are using you worse than any man should use a woman. Know this town's full of cowards who won't lift a finger to help." She laughed, a bitter sound that hurt to hear. "And what are you going to do? Buy me for an hour? Pretend to be different from the rest?" Clayton reached down and picked up the rope, his calloused hands working at the knot until it came loose. "I'm going to do what I should have done the first night I saw them drag you to that saloon." He tossed the rope into the well, where it disappeared with a faint splash. "I'm going to stop it." "You can't," Sarah May said, wrapping her arms around herself. "They'll kill you, or run you out of town, or both. Ma'am, I faced down Comanche raiders, cattle rustlers, and a grizzly bear that wanted my horse for supper. The Thompson boys don't much worry me." For the first time in weeks, Sarah May really looked at someone. Clayton Wade was perhaps 35, his face weathered but kind, his gray eyes steady. There was strength in his stance, but not the brutal kind she'd grown used to. This was the quiet strength of mountains, of things that endured. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk anything for me? You don't even know me." "Knew your husband a little," Clayton said. "Helped him load supplies once when his wagon wheel broke. Good man. Talked about you like you hung the moon." He paused, then added, "Besides, my mama raised me to stand up for folks who can't stand up for themselves. Been ignoring her teachings too long as it is." Sarah May felt tears threaten again, but these were different somehow. "They'll just hurt you and keep on with what they're doing. Nothing changes in Copper Creek. Nothing. We'll see about that," Clayton said. He touched the brim of his hat. "You get on home now. Ma'am, get some rest. Things are going to be different soon." As she walked away, Sarah May looked back once. Clayton still stood by the well, a solid figure against the night sky, for the first time since Tom died. She felt something besides despair. It wasn't quite hope. She'd learned not to trust in that, but it was something. Clayton watched until she was safe inside the Thompson house, then headed back to his room. He sat on his narrow bed and cleaned his coat by lamplight, checking each chamber, making sure the action was smooth. He'd been in enough fights to know that preparation mattered as much as courage. The next few days, he made his presence known. When Frank came to collect Sarah May one evening, Clayton was leaning against a post outside her house, whittling a piece of wood with deliberate calm. "Something you need, Cowboy?" Frank asked, his hand moving toward his gun. "Just enjoying the evening air," Clayton replied, not looking up from his whittling. "Funny how sounds carry on a quiet night. Man could hear all sorts of things. Screams, for instance." Frank's face darkened, but he wasn't drunk enough to draw on a man who carved wood with the same casual precision most men reserved for breathing. He spat in the dirt and pushed past Clayton, but his usual swagger was diminished. Inside the house, Sarah May heard the exchange through her thin window. Her heart raced, but not from fear this time. Someone was standing guard. Someone cared enough to threaten Frank Thompson on her behalf. The Thompson brothers convened at McGraw's that night, their usual table in the corner thick with cigar smoke and anger. "That cowboy's becoming a problem," Jake said, dealing cards with sharp movements. "Let me and some boys run him off," Hank suggested, always eager to prove himself the equal of his older brothers. "And if he doesn't run?" Frank asked. You see how he wears that iron? That's a man who's used it before. Jake considered this, his piggy eyes calculating. Every man's got a price or a weakness. We just need to find his... Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Clayton Wade stood at his window, watching the saloon, patient as stone. He'd learned long ago that most problems solved themselves if you gave them enough rope. But sometimes, a man had to step in and cut the noose in her cold bed. Sarah May pulled the quilts high and dared to think about tomorrow for the first time in weeks. Not with hope, exactly, but without the crushing certainty that it would be just another day of shame. Someone had seen her by the well and hadn't turned away. Someone had said things would be different. She fell asleep whispering a prayer she hadn't said since childhood, not for herself, but for the gray-eyed cowboy who'd thrown her rope down the well and stood between her and Frank Thompson like he had every right to be there. In a town full of cowards and complicity, one man had decided to be something else. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but for once, Sarah May didn't feel quite so alone in the storm. The market day dawned cold and clear, with frost painting the windows of Copper Creek in delicate patterns. Sarah May woke with the familiar dread that accompanied these Saturdays when the town square filled with merchants, farmers, and miners looking to spend their wages. The Thompson brothers always found market days profitable. More men in town meant more potential customers. She dressed in her faded blue dress, the one that had been her second best when Tom was alive. Now it hung loose on her thinning frame, but it was clean and decent, a small rebellion against what they'd made her become. As she pinned up her hair, she heard Jake's heavy boots on the porch. "Get yourself ready, girl," he called through the door. "Market day, and we aim to make the most of it." Sarah May's hands stilled on the pins. Something in his voice was different, a gloating satisfaction that sent ice through her veins. She opened the door to find all three brothers waiting, dressed in their best clothes like merchants preparing to display their finest wares. "What's this about?" she asked, though her heart already knew. "Business, sweet sister," Frank said with a tobacco-stained grin. "Supply and demand. You're the supply, and there's plenty of demand at the market." They marched her through the streets as the town began to stir. Early shoppers were already examining goods in the square. Bolts of cloth, sacks of grain, tools, and sundries spread on tables and wagon beds. Sarah May kept her eyes down, but she could feel the stares, hear the whispers starting already. The Thompson brothers had set up near the stock pens, where men gathered to trade horses and cattle. They'd brought a wooden crate for her to stand on, like she was livestock at auction. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Sarah May. "Now, boys," Jake called out to the gathering crowd. "We got something special today. Clean, young, knows how to treat a man right. Who wants to start the bidding?" Sarah May stood on the crate, her whole body trembling. This was beyond anything they'd done before. In the saloon, in her house, there had been shadows to hide in, walls to contain her shame. Here, under the bright winter sun, with the entire town as witness, she was exposed like a wound. Women pulled their children away, covering young eyes. Men either leered or looked away, depending on their conscience. Pastor William stood at the door of his church at the far end of the square, watching but making no move to intervene. A miner named Josiah Briggs stepped forward, coins jingling in his hand. "I'll take an hour," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Some men laughed, others shifted uncomfortably. That's when Clayton Wade appeared. He came through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, his spurs ringing on the frozen ground. He wore his long coat open despite the cold, his gun visible, his gray eyes fixed on the Thompson brothers with an intensity that made strong men step aside. The laughter died. Conversation stopped. Even the livestock seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, their lowing and nickering fading to uneasy silence. Clayton walked straight to the crate where Sarah May stood, her face burning with humiliation. Without asking permission, without acknowledging the Thompson brothers, he held up his hand to help her down. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "this ends now." Sarah May looked at his offered hand, then at the Thompson brothers, who were already moving forward, faces dark with anger. "The hell it does!" Jake snarled, reaching for the hideout gun in his boot. Clayton moved faster than thought. His Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic. The barrel centered on Jake's chest. "You pull that iron, and you'll be explaining yourself to St. Peter before your hand clears leather." Frank and Hank started to move, but Clayton's voice cracked like a whip. "Stand fast, both of you. First man goes for his gun gets a bullet. Second man gets to watch his brother die, then gets one himself." The entire market square had gone still. Merchants stopped hawking their wares. Women peered from behind barrels and wagons. Men who'd been examining horses now watched a different kind of showdown. "You can't take what's ours," Jake said, but his hand had stopped moving toward his boot. "She's not yours," Clayton said, his voice carrying across the square. "She's not anybody's. She's a widow woman you've been forcing into shameful work, and every man here knows it. Every man here has stood by and let it happen." He raised his voice without taking his eyes off the brothers. "You all want to pretend you didn't know? Want to act like this was her choice? Look at her. Look at what you've all been party to." Some men found urgent business elsewhere. Others stood transfixed, shame and fascination warring on their faces. "Now," Clayton continued, "Mrs. Thompson is coming with me. Any man who's got issue with that can speak up now." Josiah Briggs melted back into the crowd, his coin still clutched in his sweaty palm. Others who'd been eyeing Sarah May like a cut of meat suddenly found the ground mighty interesting. Jake's face had gone purple with rage. "You think you can just ride into our town and take what's ours? Boys, I think this cowboy needs a lesson in property rights." "Property?" Clayton's laugh was cold as winter wind. "You want to talk property? Let's talk about how you took insurance money meant for your brother's widow. Let's talk about how you've been selling her like she was a head of cattle. Any judge in the territory would have you horsewhipped. Ain't no judge here." Frank spat. "No," Clayton agreed. "There's just me." He finally looked down at Sarah May, his eyes softening. "Ma'am, will you come with me? I've got a wagon ready. We can be gone from this place within the hour." Sarah May felt the weight of the entire town's gaze. Part of her wanted to refuse, to spare this brave stranger the trouble that would surely follow. But a larger part, the part that had stood at the well with a rope in her hands, reached out and took his offered hand. The moment she stepped down from that crate, something shifted in the air. The spell was broken. She wasn't merchandise anymore. She was a woman being helped down by a gentleman. As normal as Sunday church. "She's mine now," Clayton said, the words ringing across the square like a declaration of war and emancipation rolled into one. "Any man who's got a problem with that can find me ready to discuss it. But she won't be for sale again. Not today. Not ever." He holstered his gun with the same liquid grace he'd drawn it, then offered Sarah May his arm. She took it, her fingers gripping the wool of his coat like a lifeline. They walked through the crowd, which parted silently. Some women looked at Sarah May with something that might have been respect. Men who'd visited her in the night couldn't meet her eyes. The Thompson brothers stood frozen by their makeshift auction block, calculating the cost of pursuit versus the risk of laid. As they reached the edge of the square, Clayton paused and turned back. "You boys try to follow us. You'll find I'm not near as charitable as I've been today. Take your losses and count yourselves lucky to still be breathing." Then he and Sarah May walked on, leaving behind the market square, the whispers, and the life of degradation she'd been forced to live. Behind them. The town of Copper Creek stirred back to life, but something fundamental had changed. A line had been crossed, a stand had been taken, and everyone who'd witnessed it would remember the day a lone cowboy declared a broken woman worth fighting for. Sarah May didn't look back. For the first time in 49 days, she was walking away from shame instead of toward it, her hand on the arm of a man who saw her as human. "Thank you," she whispered. Clayton Wade just nodded, his eyes already scanning the road ahead for trouble. Don't thank me yet, ma'am. This is far from over. The wagon rolled steadily away from Copper Creek, its wheels crunching through patches of snow and frozen mud. Clayton had prepared well: blankets, provisions, and a rifle within easy reach. Sarah May sat beside him on the bench, her few possessions in a carpetbag at her feet, still hardly believing this was real. The road wound through a canyon before opening into a valley where Clayton's cabin stood, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney already sending up smoke. He'd sent word ahead to old Miguel, who looked after the place, to get a fire going. "It's not much," Clayton said as they approached. "But it's solid. Built it myself 2 summers back. Figured I'd need a place to winter between cattle drives." Sarah May studied the cabin and the land around it. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks white with snow. A stream ran nearby, its water still flowing despite the cold. There was a small barn, a corral, and what looked like the beginnings of a garden plot. "It's perfect," she said softly. After the deteriorating Thompson house, this looked like a palace. Clayton helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful and respectful. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. That wind's got teeth today." The cabin's interior was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and a ladder leading to a loft. The furniture was handmade but solid. A table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire. Warm red and orange flames danced in the fireplace, casting a welcoming glow. Sarah May stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with herself. For weeks, she'd moved only when directed, spoken only when spoken to. This freedom felt foreign, almost frightening. "You take the loft," Clayton said, setting her carpetbag by the ladder. "I'll bed down here by the fire. Tomorrow we can figure out better arrangements, maybe hang a curtain for privacy." I don't know what to say," Sarah May managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Nothing needs saying," Clayton replied, busying himself with the coffee pot. "You're safe here. That's all that matters right now." As he worked, Sarah May noticed things about him she'd been too frightened to see before. The way he moved with economy, no wasted motion, the care he took with simple tasks, hands that could draw a gun in a blink now gently measured coffee grounds. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why did you do it? You don't owe me anything." Clayton paused, his back to her. When he turned, his gray eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the cabin walls. "Had a sister once," he said quietly. "Mary Catherine. Sweetest girl you ever met. Married a man who turned mean when he drank. By the time I got back from the war, she was dead." He said she fell down the stairs. His jaw tightened. Whole town knew better, but nobody did anything. Nobody stood up for her. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. "Swore I'd never stand by again when I saw a woman being mistreated. Took me too long to act in your case, and I'm sorry for that." Sarah May wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, feeling its heat seep into her cold hands. "You acted when nobody else would. That's what matters." They sat by the fire as darkness fell, not talking much, just existing in the same space without fear or shame. Sarah May felt something unknotting in her chest, a tightness she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she climbed to the loft. A proper bed waited there, with clean sheets and warm blankets. She lay down fully clothed, still not quite believing she wouldn't hear boots on the stairs, wouldn't have to steel herself for another night of horror. Below, she could hear Clayton moving about, banking the fire, checking the door locks. The sounds were domestic, peaceful, safe. For the first time in 7 weeks, Sarah May slept without nightmares. She woke to sunlight streaming through the loft window and the smell of bacon cooking. For a moment, she thought she was back with Tom, that the past weeks had been some terrible dream. Then reality reasserted itself, but gently this time. Clayton was at the stove when she climbed down, his movements practiced and efficient. "Morning," he said without turning. "Hope you're hungry. Been a while since I cooked for anyone but myself." They ate at the small table, bacon, biscuits, preserves, and strong coffee. Sarah May found herself ravenous, as if her body was remembering how to want things again. "I can work," she said suddenly. "I can cook, clean, tend a garden. I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," Clayton said firmly. "But if it makes you feel better, I could use the help. This place needs a woman's touch, and my cooking would drive off a starving coyote most days." A tiny smile tugged at Sarah May's lips, the first in so long she'd forgotten the feeling. That bacon was perfect. "Bacon's easy. Wait till you taste my attempt at stew." They spent the day settling in. Clayton showed her around the property, the root cellar stocked with preserves, the woodshed filled for winter, the small barn where his horses stayed. Sarah May found herself planning improvements. Curtains for the windows, herbs for the kitchen garden come spring, maybe even flowers by the door. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they stood on the cabin's porch watching the light fade. "They'll come," Sarah May said quietly. It wasn't a question. Likely so. Clayton agreed. "The Thompson boys don't strike me as the forgiving type. I've brought trouble to your door." Clayton turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Ma'am, I've been courting trouble since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. At least this time it's for a good reason." That night, Sarah May lay in the loft, listening to the wind in the pines and Clayton's steady breathing below. She thought about the market square, about standing on that crate like livestock, about the moment Clayton's hand reached up to help her down. She'd been saved. The word felt strange, almost too large for what had happened, but as she pulled the warm blankets higher and listened to the peaceful sounds of the cabin, she began to believe it might be true. Outside, snow began to fall, covering their tracks from town, blanketing the valley in pristine white. But Sarah May knew the Thompson brothers wouldn't let winter stop them. They'd come for their property, for their pride, for their twisted sense of ownership. When they did, they'd find Clayton Wade waiting, and they'd learn that some things, some people, weren't for sale at any price. In the darkness of the loft, Sarah May whispered a prayer, not for herself this time, but for the gray-eyed cowboy who'd declared her worth saving. She'd forgotten what hope felt like, but here in this simple cabin, with a good man standing guard below, she began to remember. The fire crackled in the hearth, the snow continued to fall, and, for the first time in 49 days, Sarah May Thompson fell asleep feeling human. They came on the fourth night, just as Clayton had predicted. The dogs he'd borrowed from Miguel started barking first, their warning cries echoing across the frozen valley. Sarah May woke instantly, her body tensed with a familiar fear that had become second nature. "Stay in the loft," Clayton called up, his voice calm but firm. She heard him moving below, the metallic click of rifles being checked, the scrape of furniture being positioned. Through the loft window, she could see them, dark shapes against the snow. At least 8 riders. The Thompson brothers had brought reinforcements, hired guns from the saloons and mining camps. They dismounted at the edge of the property, using the barn for cover. "Clayton Wade," Jake Thompson's voice carried across the cold air. "You've got something that belongs to us. Send her out, and we'll let you live." Clayton's answer was to step onto the porch, rifle in hand, pistol at his hip. The moon was bright, turning the snow-covered ground into a stark battlefield of light and shadow. "The lady's not going anywhere," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had silenced the market square. "You boys had your chance to do right by her. You chose different. Now live with it." "She's ours by rights," Frank shouted from behind the barn. "Her husband's debts passed to us. The law? Don't talk to me about law." Clayton cut him off. "You want to take this to a judge? Explain how you've been forcing a widow into prostitution? I'm sure the territorial marshal would be real interested in that story." Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah May crept to the ladder, unable to stay hidden while Clayton faced danger for her sake. She'd just started down when the first shot rang out. The window beside the door exploded in a shower of glass. Clayton dropped to one knee, rifle already at his shoulder, and returned fire. The muzzle flash lit his face for an instant. Calm, focused, deadly. That was warning shot. Wade, Jake called. Next one won't miss. Neither will mine. Clayton replied, and fired again. A man cried out from behind the water trough, one of the hired guns, clutching his shoulder. The night erupted. Gunfire came from 3 directions, muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies. Clayton moved with practiced ease, firing, reloading, changing position. But he was 1 man against 8, and they were spreading out, trying to flank the cabin. Sarah May reached the main floor just as a bullet punched through the door, showering splinters. Without thinking, she grabbed Tom's old shotgun from above the mantel. Clayton had cleaned and loaded it that first day. Just in case. I told you to stay hidden, Clayton snapped, but there was no time for argument. 2 men were rushing the porch from the left. Sarah May had never shot at a person before, but she'd hunted rabbits with her father. She raised the shotgun, remembered to brace for the kick, and pulled the trigger. The blast caught the first man in the legs, sending him tumbling into the snow with a scream. Good shot, Clayton said, firing at the second man, who dove for cover. Can you reload? Her hands shook, but she broke the breech, ejected the spent shell, fumbled new ones from the box on the mantel. Muscle memory from those long-ago hunting trips with Papa took over. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Thompson brothers shouted orders, trying to coordinate their hired thugs. But Clayton's deadly accuracy and Sarah May's unexpected resistance had shaken them. Then Hank Thompson made a fatal mistake. Young and eager to prove himself, he broke cover and charged the cabin, pistols blazing. Clayton's rifle spoke once. Hank stumbled, fell, and didn't rise again. Hank! Frank's anguished cry cut through the gunfire. You killed him! You bastard! The shooting intensified. Windows shattered. Bullets chewed into the log walls. Clayton pulled Sarah May down behind the overturned table as lead filled the air above their heads. When I start shooting, you run for the root cellar, he said, reloading with quick, sure movements. Bar the door and don't come out until... No. The word came out fiercer than she'd spoken in months. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not leaving you. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Her hair was wild, her face smudged with powder smoke, but her eyes blazed with something he recognized, the will to fight, to survive, to protect what mattered. All right then, he said. Together. They fought side by side as the cabin turned into a battlefield. Sarah May's shoulder ached from the shotgun's kick, but she kept loading, kept firing. Clayton was everywhere at once, at a window, behind the door, checking their flanks. A thrown torch landed on the porch, flames licking at the dry wood. Clayton kicked it into the snow before it could catch. Another crashed through a broken window. Sarah May grabbed the water bucket and doused it, coughing from the smoke. They're trying to burn us out, Clayton said grimly. That's when they heard it. Hoofbeats, lots of them, coming fast from the direction of town. Both sides paused, uncertain. Had the Thompson brothers called for even more help? But the voice that rang out wasn't one of Jake's thugs. It was Marshal Ben Hawkins from Denver, his star glinting in the firelight. This is the law. Every man drop your weapons, or we'll drop you where you stand. The marshal had brought a posse, 10 men, all armed, spreading out to surround the attackers. Someone in Copper Creek, it seemed, had finally found their conscience and sent for real law. Marshal, this ain't your jurisdiction, Jake protested, but his voice had lost its bluster. Is now, Hawkins replied. Got a telegram about forced prostitution, attempted murder, and about 6 other crimes. You boys are under arrest. The fight went out of the Thompson men, faced with real authority. They were just what Clayton had always known them to be, cowards and bullies. One by one, they dropped their guns. Frank fell to his knees beside Hank's still form, weeping. As the posse rounded up the attackers, Marshal Hawkins approached the cabin. Clayton and Sarah May emerged, both powder-stained and weary, but standing tall. Mr. Wade? Mrs. Thompson? The marshal tipped his hat. Sorry we didn't get here sooner. Had to ride hard from Denver. You folks all right? "We are now," Clayton said, his arm unconsciously moving to steady Sarah May, who was swaying on her feet as the adrenaline faded. "Who sent for you?" Sarah May asked. Hawkins smiled slightly. "Had a visit from a Mrs. Margaret Wilkins. Seems her conscience finally got the better of her. Told us everything, what those boys had been doing to you, how the whole town knew and did nothing. She was right ashamed. Ma'am, said someone needed to stand up for what was right." Sarah May felt tears prick her eyes. One person had stood up, then another, the ripples of courage spreading outward. "We'll need statements from both of you," Hawkins continued, "but that can wait for morning. These boys won't be troubling you again, that much I can promise." As the posse led the Thompson brothers away in shackles, Jake turned back, his face twisted with hate. "This ain't over. Wade, you can't just take—" "Yes, it is over," Clayton said quietly. "And she was never yours to take in the first place." Later, after the marshal and his men had made camp near the barn, after the broken glass had been swept up and boards nailed over the windows, Clayton and Sarah May sat by the fire. The cabin still smelled of gunpowder and smoke, but it was quiet now, peaceful. "You fought for me," Sarah May said wonderingly. "You could have been killed. You fought too," Clayton reminded her. "That was a hell of a shot with the scattergun." She looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly. I hope that man will be all right. He'll live, walk with a limp maybe, but he'll live." Clayton added another log to the fire. "You did what you had to do. No shame in defending yourself." They sat in companionable silence, processing the night's events. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the battle scars in the yard. "What happens now?" Sarah May asked. "Now you're free." Clayton said simply, "Really free. The Thompson boys will hang or rot in prison. You can go anywhere, do anything, start fresh." Sarah May considered this, the weight of true freedom settling on her shoulders like a warm cloak. Then she looked at the man beside her, this cowboy who'd risked everything for her, who'd stood against the world and declared her worth saving. "What if I don't want to go anywhere?" she asked softly. Clayton turned to meet her eyes, and something passed between them. Not quite love yet, but the promise of it, the seed of something that could grow in soil watered by courage and trust. "Then you stay," he said. "Long as you want. This place could use a woman's touch anyway." Sarah May smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "I think I'd like that." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls began the slow, sweet process of healing. The battle was won, but the best part of the story was just beginning. Winter settled over the valley like a benediction, quiet and healing. In the weeks following the attack, Clayton and Sarah May fell into a rhythm of shared work and careful companionship. The cabin, once a bachelor's stark shelter, began to bloom under Sarah May's touch, curtains at the windows, herbs drying from the rafters, the smell of fresh bread each morning. Clayton would rise before dawn to tend the horses and check his trap lines. When he returned, Sarah May would have coffee ready, strong and black the way he liked it. They'd eat breakfast together, planning the day's tasks, their conversation easy and unpressured. One morning, Clayton came in from splitting wood to find Sarah May mending one of his shirts, her needle moving in precise, careful stitches. The domesticity of the scene struck him. How natural it felt. How right. He'd lived alone for so long he'd forgotten what it meant to have someone waiting when he came home. "That shirt's probably past saving," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Nonsense," Sarah May replied without looking up. "Good flannel like this deserves better than being thrown away. Just needs some care." "Like you," Clayton thought but didn't say. Instead, he poured himself coffee and watched her work, noting how the morning light caught the auburn in her hair, how her face had filled out these past weeks, losing that haunted hollow look. They were learning each other in small ways. Sarah May discovered that Clayton hummed when he worked, old trail songs and cavalry tunes from his days in the war. Clayton learned that Sarah May talked to the chickens he'd bought from a neighboring ranch, giving them names and personalities, scolding them gently when they pecked each other. One evening, as snow fell thick outside, Sarah May finally spoke of the darkness she'd endured. "There were nights," she said, staring into the fire, "when I'd lie there and try to remember Tom's face, but it kept fading, like everything good in my life was being erased." Her voice was steady, but Clayton could see the effort it cost her. They took more than they took my memories, my dignity, my faith that there was any goodness left in the world. Clayton set down the harness he'd been mending. "But you survived. That takes a kind of strength most folks don't have." "I almost didn't," Sarah May admitted. "That night at the well, I was so tired. Clayton, tired of being afraid, tired of being ashamed, tired of waking up each day knowing what the night would bring." "What stopped you?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Spite, maybe, or just one more spark of hope I didn't know I still carried. And then you showed up." She looked at him directly. "You gave me back my life. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't repay it," Clayton said firmly. "That's not how it works. You just live. You wake up each day and choose to keep going. That's payment enough." As winter deepened, they tackled the endless chores together. Clayton taught Sarah May to shoot properly, not just the panicked blast of a shotgun in battle, but real marksmanship. She proved a quick study, her eyes steady, her hands sure. "Tom never wanted me to touch guns," she said one day, after putting 6 shots in a row through a target Clayton had set up. "Said it wasn't ladylike. Tom never had to face down 8 armed men." Clayton pointed out, "Times like these, being ladylike might get you killed." Sarah May laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in her belly. It was the first time Clayton had heard her truly laugh, and the sound did something to his heart he wasn't quite ready to examine. In turn, Sarah May taught Clayton the finer points of cooking. His bachelor meals of beans and salt pork gave way to stews rich with herbs, biscuits light as clouds, pies made from the dried apples in the root cellar. "You're spoiling me," Clayton protested one night over a dinner that would have done a fancy hotel proud. "I'll get soft." "You could use some softening," Sarah May replied, then blushed at her boldness. But Clayton just smiled, that slow, rare smile that transformed his weathered face. They began to touch in small ways, his hand on her elbow to steady her on the ice, her fingers brushing his as she passed him his coffee. Each contact was like a spark, warming them both, though neither acknowledged it aloud. One night, a blizzard howled outside, piling snow against the windows. They sat by the fire, Clayton whittling while Sarah May read from a book of poetry he'd bought on his last trip to town. Her voice was soft, giving music to the words, and Clayton found himself watching her more than his carving. "How do I love thee, let me count the ways," she read, then stopped abruptly, color flooding her cheeks. Perhaps something else would be better. "No," Clayton said quietly. "I like it. Please." She continued, her voice growing stronger, and Clayton set down his knife to listen fully. When she finished, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken things filling the space between them. "My husband, Charles, my first husband, before Tom, he used to read to me," Sarah May said suddenly. "He died of fever our first winter here. Then Tom, and now—" She trailed off. "You think you're cursed," Clayton said. It wasn't a question. Sarah May nodded, tears threatening. "Everyone I care for dies or leaves. Maybe I should go before—" "No." The word came out harsher than Clayton intended. He gentled his voice. "Sarah May, you're not cursed. You've had more than your share of sorrow, that's true, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve happiness. What if something happens to you because of me?" Clayton moved to sit beside her on the small settee he'd bought in town, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I've faced Comanche raids, cattle stampedes, and the whole Confederate Army. I think I can handle whatever comes." "This is different," she insisted. "This is—" This is life. Clayton interrupted gently. We can't live in fear of what might happen. All we have is now, this moment, this choice to keep going. Sarah May looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who asked nothing of her, who'd given her shelter and protection and time to heal, who treated her not as damaged goods but as a woman worth fighting for. "Clayton," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what was growing in her heart. He seemed to understand. "There's no rush," he said. "We have time." And they did. As winter slowly gave way to spring, as the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, something else was growing between them. It was in the way Clayton's face lit up when he came home to find Sarah May there. It was in how Sarah May hummed while she worked. The same trail songs Clayton favored. It was in the comfortable silences and the easy conversations, the shared meals and shared labor. One day, in early March, Clayton came back from town with news. The Thompson brothers were convicted. Jake and Frank got 20 years hard labor. The rest got 5 to 10. Sarah May absorbed this, waiting for the relief that didn't come. It doesn't matter anymore, she realized aloud. They can't hurt me now. Not because they're in prison, but because I'm not that broken woman anymore. No, Clayton agreed. You're not. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Sarah May slipped her hand into Clayton's. He squeezed gently, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I know I come with a past that—" "We all have pasts," Clayton said. "What matters is what we build from here." Sarah May turned to face him, seeing in his gray eyes not desire or possession, but something deeper, respect, affection, the promise of partnership. "Then let's build something good," she said. Clayton lifted her hand to his lips, the gesture old-fashioned and gentle. "I'd like that, Sarah May. I'd like that very much." As darkness fell over the valley, they sat together, no longer cowboy and rescued widow, but two people choosing to face whatever came next side by side. The past would always be there, scars that would never fully fade, but the future was theirs to write. Spring came to Colorado in fits and starts, teasing with warm days before plunging back into frost. But finally, in late April, the last snow melted from the valley, and the world erupted in wildflowers and new grass. Sarah May stood in the garden she'd planned all winter, her hands deep in the dark soil, planting the seeds of a new life, both literally and figuratively. It had been 5 months since Clayton Wade had declared, "She's mine now," in the market square. 5 months since he'd stood between her and the darkness that had threatened to swallow her whole. In that time, they'd built something neither had dared hope for, a partnership based on respect, growing affection, and the quiet understanding of two people who'd seen too much to take peace for granted. But peace, Sarah May had learned, was sometimes fragile. The rider appeared on a Tuesday morning, his horse lathered from hard riding. Clayton was in the barn, and Sarah May was hanging laundry when the stranger dismounted at their gate. Something in his bearing, the way he stood, the set of his shoulders, sent ice through her veins. "Mrs. Thompson?" The man was young, barely 20, with the badge of a territorial deputy on his vest. "I'm Deputy Collins. I need to speak with Mr. Wade." Clayton emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. He'd heard the horses, seen Sarah May's tension. "I'm Wade. What's this about?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I've got some bad news. Jake Thompson escaped from prison 3 days ago during a work detail. Killed a guard, stole a horse. We think he might be headed this way." Sarah May's knees went weak. Clayton moved to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "You think, or you know?" he asked the deputy. He was heard ranting about unfinished business, about making you pay for his brother's death and taking back what was his. Collins looked apologetically at Sarah May. "Marshal Hawkins sent me to warn you, said to tell you he's got men looking, but Jake knows this country. Could be anywhere." After the deputy left, promising to check back in a few days. Clayton and Sarah May stood in their kitchen, the weight of the news settling over them like a shroud. "I should leave," Sarah May said, her voice hollow. "If I go, maybe he'll follow me. Leave you in peace." Clayton's response was to pull her into his arms, the first time he'd held her like this. Not for comfort after nightmares, but as a man holds a woman he's come to love. "You're not running anymore," he said firmly. "Neither of us is. We faced him down once, we'll do it again if we have to." Over the next days, they prepared. Clayton cleaned and loaded every weapon in the house, taught Sarah May to use his Winchester rifle. They moved the chickens into the barn, brought the horses closer, stocked the root cellar in case of siege. But more than physical preparations, they strengthened each other. "I'm not afraid," Sarah May said one evening as they kept watch together, the rifle across her lap. "I should be, but I'm not. Is that strange?" "No," Clayton replied. "You've already survived the worst he could do to you. You came out the other side. That kind of strength doesn't leave you." On the fourth night after the warning, the dog started barking just after midnight. Clayton was up instantly, Sarah May right behind him. Through the window, they could see a figure by the corral, Jake Thompson, thinner than before, his face gaunt with rage and prison hardship. "Wade," Jake's voice cracked across the darkness. "Send out my property, and maybe I'll kill you quick." Clayton stepped onto the porch, rifle ready. "Jake, you're a fool for coming here. Turn around, right away. Live your life somewhere else." "Live?" Jake laughed bitterly. "You killed my brother, took my woman, destroyed my life. What life is there for me?" "The one you choose," Clayton said. "It doesn't have to end here." But Jake was past reasoning. The madness of loss and confinement had eaten away whatever humanity he'd once possessed. He went for his gun. What happened next would be debated in Copper Creek for years. Some said Clayton fired first, his reflexes still sharp from years of danger. Others claimed Jake's shot came a heartbeat before, going wild in his fury. But Sarah May, watching from the doorway, saw the truth. Both men fired at almost the same instant. Jake's bullet caught Clayton in the shoulder, spinning him against the doorframe. Clayton's shot was truer, taking Jake center mass, dropping him to his knees in the dirt. "Clayton!" Sarah May caught him as he slumped, blood spreading across his shirt. But he was conscious, grimacing more in annoyance than pain. "Just a scratch," he muttered, though they both knew better. Jake Thompson lay in the yard, his breathing labored. Sarah May looked at the man who'd tormented her, sold her like cattle, tried to destroy everything good she'd found. She waited for satisfaction, for rage, for something, but all she felt was pity. She helped Clayton to a chair, then walked out to where Jake lay dying. His eyes found hers, filled with hate even now. "You were mine," he gasped. Sarah May knelt beside him, not in submission, but in common humanity. "I was never yours," she said quietly. "I was never anybody's property. I'm a person. Jake, that's all I ever wanted you to see." Something flickered in Jake's eyes, perhaps understanding, perhaps just the dimming of life. He died as the sun crept over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of redemption. The aftermath was swift. Deputy Collins arrived with a posse to find the drama already ended. Clayton's wound, while painful, was clean. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder without hitting bone or vital organs. Sarah May tended him with steady hands, drawing on frontier wisdom and sheer determination. "You're going to have a scar," she said, wrapping fresh bandages 2 weeks later. "Add it to the collection," Clayton said, then caught her hand. "Sarah May, I have something to ask you." She stilled, her heart suddenly racing. "These past months, you've brought something to my life I didn't even know was missing. You've made this cabin a home, made me remember what it's like to have someone to come home to." He reached into his pocket with his good hand, pulled out a simple gold ring. "I bought this last month in Denver. Been waiting for the right moment." "Clayton, let me finish. I know you've been married twice before, both times ending in sorrow. I can't promise you forever. No one can. But I can promise you'll never face another storm alone. I can promise to stand beside you, protect you, cherish you for whatever days we're given." He looked up at her, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "Sarah Mae Thompson, will you marry me?" Tears ran down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Clayton Wade, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with his good hand, and she kissed him, gentle and sweet and full of promise. They were married a month later in the valley, with Miguel and his wife as witnesses, Deputy Collins standing as best man. Sarah Mae wore a new dress Clayton had ordered from Denver, pale blue like the morning sky. Clayton wore his best shirt, his arm still in a sling but his eyes bright with joy, as the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife. Sarah Mae looked out over the valley that had become her refuge. The cabin stood strong, smoke rising from the chimney. The garden showed green shoots of promise. The mountains rose eternal, guardians of this small paradise they'd carved from sorrow. "I now pronounce you Mr. and Mrs. Wade," the preacher said. "What God has joined, let no man put asunder." As Clayton kissed his bride, Sarah Mae thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the depths of despair to this moment of pure joy. She'd been broken, sold, nearly destroyed, but she'd survived. And more than survived. She'd found love with a man who saw her worth when the rest of the world saw only shame. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah Mae leaned into her husband's good shoulder. "Do you remember what you said that day in the market? She's mine now." Clayton smiled. "Caused quite a stir. You were wrong, you know," Sarah Mae said. He looked at her in surprise, and she smiled. "I'm not yours. I'm my own person, free to choose, and I choose you, Clayton Wade, today, tomorrow, and all the days after." Clayton lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the gold band that marked their union. "And I choose you, Sarah Mae Wade, always." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together, two souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk into the light. The past would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They'd written a new ending, one where love triumphed over cruelty, where courage defeated oppression, where a woman's worth was measured not by what had been done to her, but by the strength she'd shown in rising above it. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the valley, another answered. Sarah Mae smiled, understanding the sound now, not loneliness, but connection, not sorrow, but hope. She was home, she was free, she was loved, and that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, redemption, and courage in the Old West. I'd love to know where you're listening from, whether it's during your commute, at home, or somewhere else entirely. Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Sarah Mae and Clayton's journey in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring more of these powerful historical tales to life.